There are many opposition parties, including some in the SJB, who have often said, even before elections, that the IMF conditions could have been renegotiated so that more relief would have been provided to people. What is truth behind this? What do we need to know?
I think we had negotiated to our best of our ability and for the best for the country. I can assure that these conditions that we have negotiated are the most possible and best terms and conditions. I don't think any other, even when any other people involved, wouldn't get a different outcome. Then in 2007, government started to borrow on commercial basis. It's okay to have commercial borrowings as long as those borrowings have been invested properly and generated short-term gains, so that government would have been able to repay those obligations when coming maturing. Then when we went into that kind of trap, then what happens? To sustain, every time someone should be able to lend you to continue the process. When you have to repay those debt obligations, obviously any government will have to go back to the market and borrow new to repay earlier external debt.
So it's
So
a
it became a
never-ending
cycle of going to the commercial markets, borrow more and settle earlier debt obligation and then go back to the market.
So, Governor, would it be right to say that to get out of this never-ending cycle, you have to grow the economy?
One is we have to break the cycle of borrowing, spending, and not investing properly this borrowed money. And secondly, basically get to house in order in terms of recurrent expenditure and the borrowing, revenue, expenditure, and the how they invest this money. Obviously, any government needs to borrow. As I look at the reserve targets, we need to build at least more than 10 billion by 2028, so that paying every year 4 billion not going to cause any issue in debt servicing of the government.
Sri Lanka's economy had grown by 5.2% in the first 3 quarters of 2024, and the real GDP has grown by around 5% in 2024. How can the current government keep the momentum going? Welcome everyone. You're watching the second episode of Conversations with Alanki for this year, 2025. Now, after Sri Lanka faced its worst ever economic crisis, in April 2022, former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa offered the post of Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, who assumed duties as the new governor on the 7th of April 2022, replacing Ajit Niwad Kabral. Now, he played a pivotal role in restoring economic stability and shaping the outcome of what we see today, thanks to some crucial decisions taken. So, thank you very much, Governor, for being a part of this conversation, and welcome.
Thank you, Alan.
So my first question, Governor, is Sri Lanka's economy had grown by 5.2% in the first 3 quarters of 2024, and the real GDP has grown by around 5% in 2024. How can the current government keep the momentum going?
That's a very important the question, because now the earlier expectation on the economy to grow 2024 was around 2% if you look at the IMF forecast. And recently, World Bank revised the forecast up to 4.4%. I think in our view, it will grow at least around 5% this year.
Sure.
That's a very important recovery compared to negative 7.3 contraction in 2022 and another 2% contraction in 2023. So it's important to recover the economy, so that's where people's living standard will be improved and people's income would be going up on a steady, continuous basis, on a sustainable basis. So that's a good development. Going forward, obviously, getting the economy into a right growth path on a steady basis and on a sustainable basis is mainly driven by proper reforms and policies by all the stakeholders, including the major part is with the government, current administration, and also with the central bank as a maintaining stability going forward, both monetary and financial system stability. It's very important, but that would not happen automatically. That will come with proper policies, reforms implemented and moving in the same direction and going in a steadily same direction, implementing right policies and right reforms, then only we can continue this growth going forward, which is necessary for us to come out of this crisis and for the people of Sri Lanka to come out of the worst impact that they had during the economic crisis we had in the last 2 years.
So, like you said, Governor, Sri Lanka's economy needs to grow. If you could tell us in simple terms and in a nutshell, what does Sri Lanka need to do differently in order for the economy to grow?
In fact, there are several ways we can make economy to grow. But if you don't make it the economy to grow in the right way, you can go back to same old boom and bust cycles. For example, we have seen the economy grew by, for example, just after the end of the war in 2011, I think grew by 9.2% in 1 year. Following year grew by 8.2%. But this growth came mainly from the domestic economic activities, which obviously had a short-term high growth, but it also create a kind of a boom and bust cycles where country face balance of payment crisis, depletion of reserves, and then government had to go to the IMF and seek for bailout packages. We don't want that kind of a boom and bust cycles going forward. We need a steady, sustainable growth sustainably over a period of time. For that, we can't go back to a same growth pattern we had in the past, which was basically driven by mainly closed economic policies, domestic protection, and targeting only the domestic small market without linking up to global supply chains, without opening the economy, without promoting foreign exchange earnings capacity of the country. That is where we need to do the reforms, and that is where we need the growth to come from. If the growth is coming from the same areas like we had in the past, growing the domestic economy, having barriers on the trade, closing the economy, and targeting certain only sectors, and without earning sufficient foreign exchange, we will go back to same kind of a boom and bust cycle. We will get back to that kind of a economic cycle that will not be sustained. That's why it's important this time we carefully, both the government and the central banks, mainly the government, this responsibility lies with, to how to navigate and guide the economy to grow for us to be countries to be able to earn more foreign exchange and without being going to back to a foreign exchange crisis, and also on the fiscal side without getting back to a huge borrowings and running large fiscal deficits, and also reducing revenues and increasing expenses. So that's two parts. One is a country's capacity on foreign exchange should be the focus on the growth, and secondly, on the government fiscal operations should be focused on more fiscal consolidation, bringing down deficits, and have a more sustainable restoring the sovereign debt sustainability. Those are three key elements. We need to make sure that we are going in the same way.
Dr. Veerasinghe, we have a new government in place, and usually what happens is when governments change, their policies also change. Are you getting the sufficient support that you need from the current government to remain independent as well as to help stabilize and grow the economy?
Yeah, I think I want to make it clear here, two parts. One is central bank responsibility is to maintain stability in the so price stability key objective. Second one, financial system stability of the financial sector in terms of banks and non-bank financial institutions. That is our responsibility is to maintain stability. That is necessary requirement for the growth. Growth should come from other policies. Central bank cannot drive the growth. Central bank can only facilitate growth by maintaining stability. That is why any country that need to grow faster need to have an independent central bank that should be able to maintain stability in both price stability and financial stability. So that is a foundation for growth. So the other factors to support the growth, as I said earlier, foreign exchange earnings or the growth for other sectors, there are different agencies. For example, we have say now 20 or 30 ministries focusing on tourism, industries, the social safety net. All things are based on the government policies to promote growth. So we provide the stability, and then government can ride on that stability and get the foundation to grow.
Right.
For us to maintain stability, we need an independent central bank to maintain stability without disturbing the stability of macro stability mainly.
Let's go back 2 years when you assumed duty. Sri Lanka was in a dire situation then, and the economy had collapsed, and people were faced with a desperate and hopeless situation. What are the key measures that you took that helped bring Sri Lanka out of the depths of bankruptcy?
That I think that point I would not term that as a bankruptcy.
Mhm.
So that we when I took over, we had a situation of without having sufficient foreign exchange, at least to provide basic services to the people in this country, like the petroleum, gas, power cuts, all these things were there. People were in queues and a lot of issues were there. So immediate measures we had to take. And first day in my office, I had to raise interest rates by 700 basis points to tighten monetary policy. That's the immediate requirement to curtail the threat of hyperinflation. Already inflation was rising, and there's threat of inflation going well over 100%, which is called hyperinflation. First step that we had to take and increase interest rates to curtail demand for exchange, curtail demand for domestic demand, and apply brakes to curtail demand. That's the first part. Second part, government was not in a position to service its external debt because we didn't have sufficient resources. We had lost, depleted all of our resources. Second important step that we recommended to the government, we had to announce what they call debt standstill, temporary suspension of debt service payments until we negotiate with the creditors and restructure government debt obligation. That's an important point where that provided some space and at least conserve some of the foreign exchange that would have used to service external debt, and we were able to use that sufficient some of the small foreign exchange earnings to support the domestic economy in terms of providing essential. That was second important part. Then obviously we went into the IMF and started negotiating with the IMF for a one is a bailout package, and also they got their support to restructure external debt obligations and enter into a start level agreement, and then obviously went on like first financing assurances, start level agreement, then completing first review, second review, third review. Now we are into the fourth review next this year. Likewise, it's a gradual, steady process that we had to take all these steps for us to be able to. First thing is to prevent crash in the economy and at least make the country that people can live at least with basic essentials. That was the first priority. That we were able to achieve that within a short period, but then gradually, basically consolidate and gradually achieve all these important reforms, implement reforms, so that we came into a much more stable position since then. And there are a lot of efforts. It's not only central bank. We obviously did our monetary policy. We were able to maintain the stability of the financial sector. For example, there are a lot of concerns on the collapse of a banking system. If that happened, that was the end of the story. We wouldn't see the country if there's a banking crisis. As our result, we were able to maintain stability in the financial system. Thirdly, from the government side, the fiscal consolidation negotiating. We also involved in negotiating restructuring external debt with all the creditors, domestic creditors, external bilateral creditors, then commercial creditors. That's the next important reform that we did together with the government. And then obviously government implemented their own important fiscal consolidation, revenue mobilization measures, curtail expenditure, and then bring in a lot of new legislations to ensure this path remain stable and sustainable.
You just did mention about the IMF and obviously the importance it had given the situation. There are many views held by different people, and there are many opposition parties, including some in the SJB, who have often said, even before elections, that the IMF conditions could have been renegotiated so that more relief would have been provided to people. What is truth behind this? What do we need to know?
This when we the way I look at typing programs is not necessarily not necessarily the condition that they impose. It's a negotiated solution that we negotiate with the IMF as an independent party, which would recommend what are the right policies for the country to stabilize and grow. But we already have recognized IMF has no interest in putting the country in a difficult situation. Their interest as a member country and member institution which members more than 180 members globally. It's an independent institution. So they support a country and they come up with a bailout package that they are giving money and also provide advice just to come out of the crisis. That's where we, the government or the central bank, have the responsibility to negotiate what is the right package for the country. So they're coming from somewhere else, we're coming from here. We both need to negotiate each other and argue on the technical grounds and convince them what is right policies and get them agreement on right policy and also go ahead. It's not that, if you can remember staff level agreement we had in September 2022, first staff level agreement, all the policies that we agreed with the IMF are based on the information we had at that time. And every review in once in 6 months is an opportunity for any administration to negotiate and change the policies. There's a space, but there's no space for us to significantly deviate from the same direction. We need to move into a macroeconomic stability and growth path on the same direction. While within that, government can obviously negotiate. If you look at the every program, every review, first review, second review, and third review, you will see first review conditions are different, slightly different from second review conditions. Second review, third review condition will be different from second review condition. Likewise, they also are flexible enough to understand the reality and recent developments and how they see the outlook. On that basis is our ability to negotiate with the IMF and convince them these are the right appropriate policy. Then obviously one can negotiate. But I don't think it's fair to say that we could have negotiated better something different. I think that as people who are involved in this negotiation in all the three reviews, including myself and the official Minister of Finance and other agencies, I think we had negotiated to our best of ability and for the best for the country. If there are any space, we would certainly negotiate better terms and conditions for the interest of the country. I think I can assure you that these conditions that we have negotiated are the most possible and best terms and conditions. I don't think any other, even when any other people involved, wouldn't get a different outcome. From review to review, you can negotiate, but not
Absolutely.
necessarily pay it fast. This it confirms the program in terms of creditors have agreed to support, agreed to restructure debt, which means there's an endorsement that we are doing the right path. We agreed right policies.
So I would like to know your views as governor and also as someone who's had many years of experience and expertise. What led to this economic crisis in your view?
As I said earlier, one is that the fiscal imbalances this country has been running for several decades. For example, Sri Lanka is one of the countries where government have been running large fiscal deficits for several decades.
Mhm.
As a result, government has been living through borrowings because their revenue is much lower compared to expenditure. The gap will have to be filled through the domestic borrowings or external borrowings. When you engage in continuous for several decades of borrowings, then obviously your debt stock of sovereigns, government debt stock would rise. Only way to continue that kind of thing, you need to have access to borrowing
Mhm.
continuously so that you can borrow to repay early obligations. So then that was one of the reasons that led to this very high level of debt. Several decades of very high fiscal imbalances. That was one reason. Secondly, even if you run high fiscal deficits, if the country as a country whole was earning sufficient foreign exchange to service all this debt obligation, it could also have been sustained. But what happened with the large fiscal deficits, and also at the same time, country did not earn sufficient foreign exchange to service those external debt obligations. We went into fiscal crisis, debt crisis, and also balance of payment crisis.
Would you say we fell into a debt trap?
Debt crisis means we came into a very high level of debt, and all of a sudden we lost access to the market to repay the debt.
Right.
If you to repay, you should be able to go to the market and raise a new debt so that you can repay the debt obligations. What happened in the short term from 2020, since 2019 and 2020 and 2020 with the COVID and also with the huge tax cuts, government reduced significantly the tax revenues.
Mhm.
Became the lowest tax revenue as per the GDP in the world. Sri Lanka became that kind of country in 2020 and also 2021. As a result, we lost access to the capital markets,
Mhm.
access to the borrowings by the government. That is where the crisis triggered. Medium long term, this stress build up the debt burden,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden we lost access to the market. Then we were not able to refinance
Mhm.
the debt obligation because of the COVID and also the tax losses, tax revenue loss by the government. As a result, we lost taxes. As I said earlier, if we had the market taxes, we could have borrowed more and serviced that debt. We could have continued for some, but it was kind of a thing that about to explode at any point if we continue that course. That's why now we had to reverse the course and address all the fiscal imbalances, restore the sustainability, and earn more foreign exchange. That's the only way out.
So that brings me to my next question. When we talk about borrowing, almost, I mean, all governments borrow and take loans. So, in which period were most loans obtained, and how were these loans utilized as well? I mean, could some of these loans have been prevented, avoided?
Now, this, I think, if you look at the history of Sri Lanka's external borrowing since 1977, when you opened the economy, and that was a period Sri Lanka had access to large amount of concessional borrowings. For example, from the ADB, World Bank, Japan, all the countries, even UK, Western countries, gave us very concessional external borrowings at 0%, 1% for 30, 40 years. That started in 1970s, late 70s, 80s, came up to the almost early 2000. Those borrowings were sustainable because debt service burden was that much high, and economy was also growing reasonably, so that we had the affordability of servicing those uh, external debt, which was sustainable because very low interest rates and longer term repayment. Then in 2007, government started to borrow on commercial basis. In addition to concessional borrowing, for example, if you look at 2007 stock of government external debt, only less than, I think, 4% around was on commercial debt and 6% on concessional debt. That was in 2007. Over a period of time, when it became 2012-13, commercial component went up to close to 50% compared to concessional share of the total debt came to half of that. So that's where the burden on commercial borrowings increased starting 2007 onwards up to 2013-14. There was a composition change. So when you have a commercial borrowings, which means interest rates are higher, repayment periods are lower compared to 20-30 year repayment, you have maximum 10-year repayment period with high interest rates.
Sure.
It's okay to have commercial borrowings as long as those borrowings have been invested properly and generated short-term gains so that government would have been able to repay those obligations when coming maturing. So what happened, those investment borrowings were mainly used to finance what I call the large fiscal deficits for recurrent expenditure, pay salaries, wages, subsidies, all these things were financed through this commercial borrowings. When you have a system where it's like your budget at home, when you start borrowing heavily and spending that money for day-to-day expenditure, food and everything, then you won't be able to repay that obligations unless you invest that borrowings and generate to high income, earn high income. That is something happened. Then when we went into that kind of trap, then what happens? To sustain, every time someone should be able to lend you to continue the process. That's why happened in successive government. I don't see this as a problem for one government or the other. It's started from late 2000, since after the end of the war, and continuously expand fiscal deficits, borrowing or expand the commercial borrowings. Commercial borrowings are okay as long as those are invested properly. Without investment, then what happened later, when you have to repay those debt obligations, obviously any government will have to go back to the market and borrow new to repay earlier external debt.
So it's
So
a
this became a
never-ending cycle.
cycle of going to the commercial markets, borrow more and settle early debt obligation and then go back to the market. So in 2022, in 2021, we lost access to the commercial borrowers. That's where the
So, Governor, would it be right to say that to get out of this never-ending cycle, you have to grow the economy?
there are two things. One is you have to break the cycle of borrowing, spending, and not investing properly this borrowed money. That's the first part. And secondly, the basically get to house in order in terms of recurrent expenditure and the borrowings, revenue, expenditure, and the how they invest this money. Obviously, any government needs to borrow. For example, even now, next several years, government will be running a budget deficit. You can't prevent that because given the structure, government will have to run a budget deficit, which means they have to borrow. But for them to borrow, important one is to borrow on a reasonable market rates, and large amount domestic borrowing is much better than external borrowing. Even external borrowing will have to be medium to long term borrowings, and even if they borrow from externally, we should be able to ensure those borrowings are invested properly so that that can generate sufficient incomes for the government to repay that debt obligation. That's how you have to break that cycle. Without breaking that cycle, getting back to a same level of borrowings, will get back to a same problem in the future.
And also another question I have is in 2028 we have to pay a lot of debt. How will this impact the Sri Lankan economy?
I think that's again a misperception that we have to pay a lot of debt in 2028.
Okay.
So whole idea of restructuring government debt obligations, especially external debt obligations, are in 2022 we had a debt to GDP of 128% of GDP, and debt service payments per year was close to $7 billion per annum, which is over 9% of GDP. The only debt service payments for the government. That is where we had to restructure it. That's where we did not have ability to service because of the debt burden was so high, and we had to announce this debt standstill and restructure. After restructuring, we restructured and negotiated a restructuring solution where up to 2028 there's a very good space. We have to pay only interest of our debt obligations for next 5 years of the restructured debt. And then from 2028 onwards, next 10 years, we have to pay back current debt obligations on a reduced scale. Every year, start paying the capital on a small basis, on a affordable basis. That's what I see. If you look at the new debt service obligation, it is compared to 6-7 billion per year. It's about 3 to 4 billion per year on the next 10 years. If you maintain country's official resource around 8-9 billion, paying 3 to 4 billion every year is not an issue, including beyond 2028. That's why I think the people's concern that we are speculation that after 2028 we get back to a same kind of a debt issue is not correct. So that's where I think that's why we have, and also we have 4-5 years space for us to get back to earning capacity over an exchange, so that we will build up our buffers in terms of external resource, foreign exchange resource, so that we have sufficient buffers for us to meet debt service obligation going forward, even from 28 onwards. As I look at the reserve targets, we need to build at least more than 10 billion by 2028, so that paying every year 4 billion not going to cause any issue in debt servicing of the government.
And also, we are going to be having the budget
Yeah.
for the following year. How do you think support should be provided to people who need it the most? Is it possible to provide a little bit more relief?
Now that's again a challenge for the government to give relief to people who have been affected by the crisis. Then government need to identify who should get the priority. For example, if you look at the impact of the crisis in last several years, worst affected are the most vulnerable and poor people. That's why we see poverty had gone up from 8-9% of population to about 25%. So that's where the government support should first come to the people worst affected due to the crisis. Those are 25% of poor people. That's the first part. That's why you can see successive governments bringing the asylum, all these things, increasing amount. That's the first part. Secondly, there are other segment of population, for example, middle income people, fixed income earners like public sector, salary earn fixed income people. Their incomes have also not been increased up to meet the compensate for high inflation. And also, for example, plantation workers, very low income people, the income still have to go up. In private sector, certain areas, private sector salaries have been adjusted to compensate for inflation, but not all. So how the government can prioritize? Because for government giving relief, they need to have money. Either they have to collect revenues or they have to borrow. High borrowing is not an option. Only way government can use very limited resources that's available for them in terms of government revenue, they have to be very careful in how to allocate and give priority who deserves the most. That's why first I say this, poor people. Secondly, support some middle income, support some industries, support some SME, support some public sector, and also some of the low income, say plantation, like low income people. And then the best way to give the support is to increase the country's capacity to grow, so that country's GDP increasing means everyone's level of incomes are going up. That's the only way to compensate for the lost income that they had during the last 2 years. It won't happen in a short period.
And the private sector should also be
Of course, then private sector is a
supported.
large. If you look at the employment of this country, obviously government employs about 15% of the workforce. It's about 1.5 million people of 8.5 million. So another, say, 7 million is employed by the private sector businesses, private sector, all the businesses. How we can improve income of the 7.5 million workforce? Only by increasing the economic activity, increasing more value addition, increasing more, generating more incomes for the companies and business, so that they can share the high incomes with the people who are employed.
Sure.
The larger private sector will have to play a crucial role increasing the economy. That's again one other caution I have to mention. Growing economy through domestic economy is not going to work. We'll go back to a crisis. That's why we have changed the model. We need to grow the pie, but growing the economy through more foreign exchange earning capacity. Otherwise, this economic growth will not sustain. We can easier to pump up and grow through foreign policies. That will not sustain. We need to have a sustainable economic growth
Right.
through foreign exchange. That's only way that we can increase the living standards of people.
And also, finally, moving on to my final question, when it comes to today's day and age, there are a lot of international collaborations, and it's a time where, like you said, we have to open up. How can Sri Lanka collaborate with other countries or other nations to actually strengthen the economy?
Yeah, I think we should look at the global economy now. So we had the situation where uh, we have been exposed and integrated with more to the West. For example, export markets, mainly in the EU and the US. So that we were relying on those high income countries for us to export goods and services. That's fine. But going forward, what we see, the economy, global economy is balancing more towards the south. For example, now India, China, East Asia, all countries are also growing and catching up with the West as high income countries. So the way to grow by diversification of our markets and access to our markets, to these growing markets. That's where the demand for goods and services coming from in the future are not necessarily obvious. Those Western markets are also important, that they will continue to demand goods and services, but there will be another emerging demand coming from goods and services of Sri Lanka are coming from the India, China, East Asian and Asian countries. That's why we need to be get ready, integrated into supply chains of those markets as well. Then we can diversify. If something happens in one market, for example, people talk about Trump economics, and that can have impact on US economy. But if we have exposure and integration into more Indian and China and regional markets, then there's a risk mitigation. So that our businesses can still have access to different markets, so that we can continue to grow. If we rely on very few markets, if something happens to those markets, then obviously we will have an impact of that shock should be absorbed into our markets. And for us to meet that kind of shock, we should build our buffers for us to meet in a difficult day, in the rainy day. That's where we need to build the foreign exchange reserve buffers. We need to build our monetary policy buffers. We need to build the fiscal buffers in terms of revenues and primary surpluses as IMF program, and also implement proper reforms so that people can do business with the world, not with only with Sri Lanka. That's important. So that's why different business model, that people business practice to be able to do business with the world, not business only within Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Governor, for this conversation.